Monotype.
Welcome to Behind the Font, a new mini-series from Monotype that demystifies the challenging corners of the design industry. As any creative will tell you, there's a world of technical challenges that designers and type industry people face. This mini-series will dig into the technical side of type and answer questions we get all the time from designers. In our first episode in this series on font licensing, we learned what font licenses are and how they've evolved in modern times, now that anyone can be a publisher. Today, we're going to give you a crash course on the basics of a font license. First, we'll talk about what's actually in a font license. Then, we'll walk through some common font licensing use cases that you may encounter in real life. We're trying to keep these episodes short, which means we might not touch on everything you want to know about font licensing. If there's something we don't cover that you're curious about, send us a note or a voice memo at podcast@monotype.com. Part 3 of this series will include some listener questions, and we might even feature yours. Now, on to the episode. Once again, I'm here with Phil Carey-Berggren, Monotype's Vice President and Assistant General Counsel. Phil, you could and maybe should write a book on this topic, but for some reason you haven't started doing that yet. Why?
Well, it's still employed. It feels like a retirement project, but also the kind of project I'm not sure I want to do in retirement. So maybe we'll just leave that one unwritten.
Yes, I think maybe playing the guitar is a better retirement option.
Much better for me.
Before we start, we just want to make one thing clear. Phil is a lawyer, but he's not your lawyer. Nothing we discuss here should be taken as legal advice. We hope these episodes help clarify some common legal concepts, but please consult with your own attorney for legal advice on your particular scenario. All right, well, let's dig into a typical font EULA. What will you find in such a document?
So you'll typically find a few different basic sections. You'll see a preamble at the beginning. You'll see some defined terms, and you'll see license grants. There are some additional sections too that will lay out some standard terms, but for our purposes, in terms of what can you do and can you not do with a font, these are the three things that you really want to look at.
Part 1, the Preamble.
So, Phil, as like a little fun thing, why don't I take a crack at explaining the preamble because it's the most straightforward section. You can tell me if I get anything wrong. So typically, you'll find that a preamble gives some background information like the purpose, that this is a font license, the parties, the licensee and licensor. Is that the correct term?
Yep, the licensor is who grants the license. The licensee is who uses the thing.
And then the last element found in the preamble is the acceptance procedure. Why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because now we're getting beyond my pay grade.
Sure. And these are just very general terms. Like anyone can draft a EULA a little bit differently, but generally this is what you find. With the acceptance procedure, that tells you how the EULA becomes effective. How do we know that both sides have agreed to those terms? And that can be things like a click-through or actually physically signing, DocuSign, like e-signatures, something like that. There's a lot of different methods, but it definitely tells you when the contract is in effect.
So it's basically telling you what needs to happen in order to make this thing real.
Yes, for sure.
What is the most important part of the preamble that people should pay attention to?
I do think it's the acceptance procedure. So just looking at when it becomes effective, but also you want to make sure that you know who you're contracting with, what the purpose of the contract is, making sure you're agreeing to what you actually intend to agree to.
Okay, so if you license fonts from a company and then that company is acquired by another, or the fonts that your license are somehow transferred to another owner, does the license go with it, or do you need to sign a new agreement with the new licensor?
Well, like any good lawyer will tell you, it depends. Not trying to be cagey, but there are different rules depending on where you are physically located as a consumer, as well as where the licensor is located. Generally, though, pretty much every jurisdiction gears towards consumers. So as someone who entered into a font EULA, a font license, if there's a change in control, almost certainly that contract will remain in effect pursuant to its terms. There are different questions about who's on the other side, but generally you can rely that the license that you agreed to is going to continue to be in effect for as long as it says.
Okay, so the first section, the preamble, is done. Let's move on to the next section called defined terms.
Part 2. Defined terms.
Is this basically like a glossary?
Completely like a glossary. When we look at a contract, like we talked about before, it's words that are written in a native language that tell you what you can and can't do. The exception to that are these defined terms. So if there's ambiguity in a word that you want to use, or if you're worried about like something being super specific, what you do is you define it. You say that for purposes of this contract, the term EULA, the term font, means this very particular thing. So you can come into weird scenarios. Like I could draft a contract. I mean, maybe it'd be an interesting exercise to go through one of our contracts, our EULA, and change the word font to banana. It's completely enforceable. It has no legal impact on the contract, but you have this EULA that now says you're licensing a banana instead of a font.
So it sounds like this is probably a really important section to pay attention to, just in case you get a lawyer who's having a weird day.
Yeah, I mean, also, like, you should look out for potential bad actors, or if you have an idea of what a term means and you see it capitalized and defined, you want to make sure that your understanding of that definition aligns with the term that's actually defined.
And are the terms in these sections typically negotiable?
Generally, no. For what we're talking about here, I'm envisioning the license, the desktop EULA that you agree to when you want to purchase a license to use a font. So in those scenarios, just practically, there's no opportunity to negotiate because you're not talking to a person, you're dealing with a computer. If you were talking to a person, of course, you can ask for anything, but kind of practically, you got to think about like, how much is it worth to the other side if they have to get a lawyer involved to negotiate something. Typically, companies are not going to entertain that kind of negotiation on standard terms because they don't want to deal with the complexity of having one-off different definitions. And it's not about whether the requested edits, amendments are reasonable or not. It's really just about trying to keep things consistent. But, if you have enough money, everything is negotiable.
Sure. So bottom line is, if you're a individual consumer, this is a good section probably to read through and just make sure everything makes sense. And if you're a larger corporation with resources, it is an area where a lawyer might comb through it in more detail and have some kind of conversation with the licensor just to make sure everything is on the up and up.
For sure. And there are different tiers of licensing that's available, different business models, different license grants. So it's definitely worth reaching out if there's just a particular thing that's not working for you. Maybe there is a different license model that would be more appropriate.
So the rubber really meets the road in the last section, typically called license grants.
Part 3. License grants.
Is this probably the most important section of a font license for people to understand?
This is the substantive portion. This is where the magic happens and what actually gives you the right to do what you want to do. Like if what you want to do is not spelled out in the license grants, you don't have the right to do it. So you definitely want to make sure that, first of all, you understand what you want to do with the font and how that translates into the words in the EULA.
If the first section sort of outlines what the purpose of the document is and who is involved, the second section defines the particulars of what's going to be licensed. This is the section that really says, here's what you can do with the thing you're licensing, which in this case is a font.
Yeah, I definitely think you can think of the preamble and the defined terms as being more like the who and the what, and the license grants are the how and the when. Complementary to a license grant section, you'll also often find license restrictions sections within EULAs that call out with more granularity what you can't do with the fonts. So one thing to just keep in mind throughout all this is there are license grants, there are license restrictions, but that's not necessarily the entire picture.
Yeah, and I think this is a key point to highlight because the license restrictions you'll see in a contract are not 100% comprehensive. They just cover the most common topics. So if you don't have explicit permission to do something, like if it's not there in the text saying you can do this, you don't have permission to do it.
100%.
And this is probably where it's good to have a lawyer at the table, especially if you're signing a license for very widespread use at, a substantial cost, right?
For sure. Yeah. Lawyers are all about mitigating risk, and you have to have your own risk tolerance too. I don't use a lawyer for everything, but for the stuff that really does matter, that is material for me, and I make that determination, I will obviously seek outside advice.
Good call. So let's dig in a little bit more because I think this is where consumers and corporations or companies really need to understand the ins and outs. So walk me through some of the use cases, how they're defined, how they're described, that people should be aware of.
Well, the type industry breaks font licenses into different business models based on use case. Typical use cases that you see are desktop, web font, mobile app, web to print, and hardware OEM licenses.
So yeah, I want to get into several of these in depth, but let's start with desktop versus web font, because I feel like this is a distinction that trips people up a lot, where someone has a license for a font for desktop usage, somehow that ends up being used in a web application. So, for a desktop font license, you are basically able to use the font in print applications. And print could be anything from designing a flyer or to create static imagery like a JPEG or whatever for display on the web. A web font license behaves differently. What you're doing is you're embedding the code for a font into your website. And every time a page loads, it sends a signal to the server, downloads the font in the moment, and then displays it on the website. So it's actually pulling it and publishing it in the moment on a person's browser.
Yes, for sure. So how the typeface is being displayed to the public or to whom it's being displayed, both of those inputs and outputs are what you need to focus on when thinking about font license coverage.
To me, it's helpful to think in terms of publishing. So in the case of a website, you have a designer who designs the website. They do the layout, they do all the work there, and they say, this is what it's going to look like. But then every time a person loads a web page, it's as if that page is being published. So on the one hand, you've got a single design from the designer, but then it can get republished millions and millions of times. And so if you compare that to something like a book or a magazine, all of a sudden the scale of usage jumps out at you.
It's a great analogy. I love that, thinking about publishing in the context of web fonts.
And so I would imagine for someone licensing fonts for web font use, paying attention to the number of impressions that are allotted in the agreement is crucial.
Yeah, for sure. Different foundries and different business models use different terminology, but impression, page view, unique visitor are all terms that are used to try and capture that volume problem. How many times has it been published?
And this is probably one of the key areas to connect the dots between those definitions and the license grant to understand what is a page view or an impression, or what is the term being used? How is it defined? Is it a certain amount of seconds after the page loads? Is it on click? What is it? And then just to make sure that those two align for your expected usage.
100%. I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because this is an important aspect. Back before there were computers, before there were digital fonts, everything was just type to paper, type to something, displayed, right? There is no risk in losing the font because the printer controls the physical font in their print shop. So when you distribute 10,000 copies of a book, a physical book, you're not putting the font at risk. You're not distributing a font file or any kind of software with it. When you are using a font to display content on a website, when you're using it as a web font, you're actually causing the font to be downloaded to every visitor's computer.
Wow.
So the risk to the IP owner is much greater with digital exposure versus just print. So that is one of the reasons that we typically would track the usage metrics for web fonts, for mobile apps, for all of that, because that tells us how many copies of the font are getting out there too.
So then let's move on to mobile apps and talk about how licensing for a mobile app differs from licensing for the web, because I think the distinction is probably a little abstract for a lot of people.
Yeah, so mobile app is kind of a micro software license. Back before the iPhone launched in 2007, 2008, fonts were being licensed for applications, like desktop applications. They were being licensed for applications that run on very specific hardware, like medical devices, stuff like that. With the iPhone and mobile app stores, it just kind of exploded.
It's just the internet on your phone.
It made app development accessible to a lot more people. And whenever you have words on a screen, you need fonts, you need type to give voice to that brand. So mobile app licenses were developed that specifically accounted for these very limited distribution channels of iOS devices or Android devices, and playing within that ecosystem too. Mm-hmm. And it's also much more limited in terms of what you can do than like a broad hardware license.
And then in terms of use cases, the one that stretches my mental capacity the most is these, web to print server license that you mentioned. Make that make sense to me, because I've tried and I struggle with this one.
So I think it makes sense if you tie back to what's happening with the font in these particular scenarios. Mm-hmm. So a desktop environment, it's one person on their computer using the font, right? It's this closed environment.
They're in the computer?
Yeah.
With web font, there's a person who made the decision to use the font to display this content. The actual consumers of the content don't interact with the font. Like, it's cached on their system, but they can't use it to create content. When we go from, instead of one user on a desktop, we have 1 million users on the internet that are using the font. That is a different license grant. That's essentially like 1 million desktop license grants.
Right.
And the server license is an attempt to capture those differences between web font and desktop, but also allow the font to be used in a cloud environment.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe the most relatable example of a server license is sort of custom t-shirt printing or custom gift printing. I was just looking into something today to make t-shirts for my son's Little League, and there are fonts built into the program that I was looking into, and you can type anything you want, and then they will print it on as many t-shirts as you like. And so that is an example of these server licenses where the font is actually being made available to an unpredictable number of end users to design something that then gets created. And that helped it make sense to me, but there are a lot of different ways that type of usage can play out on the web.
Yeah, it can be difficult to just grasp how expansive these use cases can be until you really think about, like, there are font files traveling to millions of different, users' systems temporarily. You could have millions of people that are all designing something on a platform. The scale can be super impressive.
Yeah. And then the last major category is hardware, or what we sometimes call OEM. What does that stand for, OEM?
OEM stands for Original Equipment Manufacturer. And there's also ISV, a related term, Independent Software Vendor.
It's good to break down. Acronyms are tough sometimes. And this category includes fonts that are embedded into car dashboards, medical devices, home appliances that have screens on them. That seems a bit more controllable, right? Your usage is the number of units of hardware that you're shipping, whether it's a car or whatever.
It definitely can be, but it can also get complicated too, as hardware devices are now connected to the cloud. The difference between an application that runs on a car versus an application that runs on a computer, it can be kind of thin. But definitely the hardware OEM licenses are geared towards those different distribution tiers. So like we could have a font being embedded into a component that goes into a center stack of a car that becomes a car, right? So it's those different tiers of distribution and accounting for like where it's going.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question on behalf of a lot of people working in the creative and design world. Why can't there just be one license for everything?
One ring to rule them all.
First of all, there could be one license to rule them all, but the customer base is going to be extremely small. It's going to be prohibitively expensive for most customers. And that probably doesn't make sense for most users or for most font vendors to go that route.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't know on either side what the future is going to hold, how fonts could be used or not used. And it just feels a lot more reasonable to tailor the license grants, the business models, and the terms to those specific use cases that we're aware of.
Yeah. So the idea of having a one-size-fits-all license just doesn't really seem like it's in anybody's best interest, especially the people buying them.
No. And, there used to be a one-size-fits-all model for the type industry, right? Before digital fonts, before there were font files going back and forth, you would sell a font, a physical thing, to a print shop, and that was it. You were one and done, right? It was extremely expensive. You had a lot of control over it. And the world is just very different now. And that doesn't make sense in a lot of areas, a lot of industries, not just the fonts.
Yeah, so basically you're saying it doesn't make sense for someone who's using a font at home to pay the same amount as someone who's, using a font to build an entire cross-channel identity for a multinational company.
Yeah, right. They don't need to pay the same amount. They don't need to agree to the same kinds of terms. Each EULA is tailored to the specific use case. The goal is definitely to find the sweet spot between minimizing risk for the IP owner without stifling the customer's workflow.
Okay, so we've covered a lot in this episode, a lot of detail. Why don't we close out this part 2 with a quick recap of everything we've covered? So we went through the 3 basic parts of a EULA. It starts with the preamble. Really, the key part of the preamble is the acceptance criteria, basically what signifies a signed contract. Then we went through defined terms, which is important in that it is where you and the licensor agree on what things are called. And then the rubber really meets the road in that 3rd section called license grants, where the usage of the font you're licensing is outlined in very clear language. We've also covered the most common situations where you need a license, including desktop, web fonts, mobile apps. We've covered web-to-print platforms, and then we touched on hardware, OEM, and ISV licenses where a font is installed in a device like a car or a washing machine and then shipped. Phil, any closing thoughts or any sort of neat and tidy summations of everything we've covered today?
I think it's easy to get overwhelmed by licensing in general and font licensing in particular. But hopefully we've been able to clarify things. If you take it piece by piece and look for some common elements throughout what you're looking at, you can get through it.
And if we haven't clarified everything, good news. You can send us your questions. And in fact, we would love for you to send us questions because part 3 of this series is going to be all about answering questions. So in the next episode of Behind the Font, Phil and I are going to sit down and go through Q&A. I have some questions for him, but we're also taking questions via social. So you can send us a message on social, or you can email us at podcast@monotype.com. You can type out a question, or you can record a voice memo and attach it, and we can use it in the episode itself. But that will be part 3 of this series, where we take all of your challenging questions about licensing and I throw them at Phil and I watch him squirm. So come back for part 3, and thank you for listening. Behind the Font is a production of Monotype that's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. Thank you so much to Phil Carey-Berggren for his wonderful legal expertise and for not using too much jargon. We'll see you on the next episode of Behind the Font.